Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this episode, we are going to carry on making a wide body fender. Now, each time I say that, it sounds more and more ridiculous because we're at episode 10, which is the seventh, I believe, in the actual modeling of the wide body fender. So, as I mentioned in the last video, which was quite a bit longer than I expected, this is not an easy process. It takes time, you hit roadblocks, you have to readjust and make some changes. So what we're going to do in this episode, now that we have this base sort of model of the fender that has the hard edges that we want, we are going to incorporate the wheel arch or the opening. So as we explored in the last video, that was something that was very tricky for us to get these straight edges or lines after the fact. It was just way too difficult for us to do. So we took a step back, we got rid of all of that information in the middle, and we patched it up so that it would essentially be a fender without the opening. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how we can put that wheel arch back in. So if you've been following along, carry on with your file. If you haven't, of course, you can go to the description and download the data set that you see on the screen. There are a lot of form bodies in here at this point. We have the full fender, no arch, and with arch, which are just copies of each other at this point. We've got two full fenders, which were original versions where we had the wheel arch of the entire fender, and that's kind of where we took a step away from it. And then we have the smooth fender, which was the first one we designed. And honestly, that one looks pretty good. It probably would have been easier just to stick with that. However, there were some things I didn't like about it because, as I mentioned, I really want to carry these hard body lines through the design. That's something that Mitsubishi didn't do when they made the wide body version of this car. These lines were they were just not there on the wide body version. They started to pick up right before the door and they disappeared on the rear fender as well. So I really want to carry that design element into this wide body version. So at this point, we want to be happy with what we have on the screen because it's only going to get harder for us to make adjustments. Because this is, I'm sure, not my final version of this, I'm going to continue on with it. But if there's anything that you want to change or fix, now is a good time to do it. The next step for us is to take one of the smooth fender designs. It doesn't really matter which one. And we are going to copy the opening. So you can take the one that we did previously. It doesn't really matter because all we're doing is we're taking this inside piece and we're going to make some adjustments. So I'll take this one. This is the last one that we did. I'm going to copy these inside faces and just rotate this around a little bit. And just like before, Control C, Control V. Then what I have is just essentially the open wheel arch. We're going to bring back our full fender with arch and kind of see where this thing hits. Now, if this is behind anything, now is the time to fix it because this is going to be really tricky for us to patch. So that either means adjusting the fender flare, so pushing this back closer to the car, or pulling this further away. So one thing that I do want to note is at the bottom of this, and let's go ahead and make it box display, but at the bottom of this, it flares out like the original because I have the mud flaps on this car. Obviously, we're quite a bit wider than the original, but that is sort of the reasoning for why it flares out. And then we also want to just make sure that we take a look at the overall shape of the fender. So it bulges out and then it sort of goes straight in the back. And if that's the intent, perfect. But again, now is the time to fix it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this outside edge. I'm going to use Modify Edit Form. I'm going to reset my pivot point. I'm going to put it down here in the front because I like where that location is. And then I want to rotate this thing. So that's going to give me a little bit of extra room to play with, to sort of space things out. And as long as we're happy with that shape and that location, then I'm going to left click and move forward with the next part. Now the next part for us is going to be to make a fender lip. Now remember, when you're extruding from something like a wheel arch, we want to try to get that pivot point as close to the center of the wheel as possible. So when you reset a pivot point like this, you can't select anywhere that there's not geometry. So we really need to have something to select, but then we can manually move it down and get it close to where the center of the wheel is. Then if we use Alt, we're going to extrude the edge. Alt and Control will extrude with a crease. Because ultimately we probably aren't going to have a crease there, you could do it with or without. I'm going to do with. It's just kind of what I generally do. And I'm going to just extrude that out. And for now, I'm going to say OK. I'm going to go to my Insert Edge. And I want to figure out where I want this edge or this lip to be. Now, one thing that is extremely difficult to do in forms is to get a nice, consistent width on a face. Using this method of scaling out from a pivot point that's at the center of the wheel does help, but this is one of those areas, just like adding those straight edges, this is one of those areas that is really difficult to do. So make sure that you take some time and just work with this geometry as best you can. So now that we have this, the next thing that we want to do is we want to figure out where the edges on the surface underneath hit this design. Because ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to trim away using Insert Point. We're going to trim away a lot of this geometry. And then after we trim it away, we are going to start attaching it to the fender lip in this case. So in areas where we don't have any edges like this one, I'm going to double click it to make sure I grab the inside portion of it. And I'm going to hit delete. Now this is problematic because now we have this weird flat spot here, and if we go into our smooth display, it might not match the car anymore. You can see how it's kind of dipping down there. So we want to make sure that we do address that, and we're going to do that by using Modify and Slide Edge. We're going to pull this one closer to the center, and probably take this one. I don't know why that slide location is staying on the screen, but we're going to take this one and maybe pull it to the right a little bit. So that'll help. We will have to do some adjustments after the fact, but that gets us closer. This one here, again, there's nothing for it to attach to, so I'm going to delete. This one is relatively close to this edge, so I'm going to leave it. This one's close to this edge, so I'm going to leave that. This one's close there, and this one's close there. And again, this is part of the reason why we did that original exercise of making the OE fender, because we kind of looked at where all these edges were in order to make this shape, and that dictated things downstream. Now obviously this original shape is very smooth because we didn't add all the edges to control it. That's the basis for what we've done for pretty much everything. We're going to do the same thing over here. It looks like this one hits pretty close. This one hits close. That one is relatively close to there, there, and at the bottom. So it's not perfect, but it is enough. It's close enough. Now that we have that, we are going to go to Insert Point, and we are going to start breaking this up using Insert Point around. Now, there will be a couple of challenges. For example, this edge right here is going to be problematic because it crosses over where our wheel arch is. So it's going to be tricky back there. We're going to have a couple of areas where we're going to end up with star points, and we're going to have to deal with that. But for right now, kind of take a look at the overall design. And what we want to do is we want to start to break it up and follow the edges that we have on our wheel arch. So for example, I'm going to come over here and just sort of follow this around, trying to stay fairly consistent with the shapes that I'm working with. Now here, again, this is where it gets tricky. If we go to here, we are going to guarantee that we have a star point. For right now, that's okay. I'm just going to allow it and come down here and hit enter. I'm going to repeat that, and probably what's going to happen from this edge, we are going to just essentially bring that edge back. Remember, at this point, when we insert points like this, it's going to be flat, which is not great for our curvature. We're going to have to deal with that. But for right now, it's okay. The next step for us is to select everything inside of here. Now, box select from the bottom right to the top left will grab everything that it crosses. We'll have to do a little bit more work over here, holding down Control or Shift, and then just hit delete, and we got rid of it. Again, we're going to have to deal with this. I'm going to take that edge right there, hit delete, and get rid of it. And hopefully that doesn't mess things up too much. If you take a look at Smooth Display, you'll notice that some of these are going to start to be problematic. We'll have to go back and work on it. Looks like there's a relatively hard crease right here, something we're going to have to deal with as well. But for right now, this is okay. So back in box display, bring back our wheel arch. Now, in some cases, you might try to do something like a bridge to connect these, but because we have so many extra edges where we're controlling those creases, it's going to be tricky to do that. So my suggestion is to use the face tool and begin creating four-sided faces, just using this by snapping to the vertices wherever possible. Now, when we get to areas like this, it's going to be trickier because we can't just continue on because of that edge right there. So I'm going to say okay for now. I'm going to delete that edge, leaving a T-point over here. I'm going to have to do the same thing back here, and I'm going to have to do the same thing down here as well. We might bring those edges back at some point, but for right now, we're going to get rid of them just because it's going to make the process easier for us to build that. You can already see that that is going to be a problem because of the way that angle has changed there, but again, we're going to fix that. So once again, we're going to just use the face tool, selecting the four sides. We'll go here. This one is not really going to work. I can't really make a triangle. We'll come back and fix that one later, but I'm going to carry on. Anywhere that I do have a four-sided section, we'll do that. Carry it on down here. Again, this is tricky because of that edge. I'm just going to skip over it and then delete this one and use the face tool again. So the ultimate goal here is for us to build the fender how we want it without the opening, and then build the wheel arch how we want it without the fender, and then we can come back and start to connect all the pieces together. Now this is a little bit of a similar workflow to surfacing. When you're surfacing, you generally build one face or section of a design at a time, unlike solids where we generally build the entire solid. Here's another area where we're going to have a triangle, so I'm going to skip that for now. And then we'll come down here. And then I'm not going to worry about anything below this for right now. So if we take a look in smooth display, obviously those triangles are problematic, but the overall intent here to keep those creases seems to have worked because those edges are still there and they're there on the backside. We just need to work on how they intersect with the rest of the design. So Control-6, bring those edges back, Alt and 1, and let's figure out how we can patch this. So probably the best way to do this is to start dividing up the arch into other sections. So that's going to require us to make some adjustments. So for example, this one here will likely be better served over here, pointing more toward the center of the wheel. And then once we have that, we can get rid of this edge. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to pull this one over a bit further as well. So insert point, we're going to come from here, a little bit more straight following the curvature that we're going for. And once again, we want those to point toward the center of the wheel. This is going to be tricky because of that triangle there, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this face, and now I can use the face tool to go back and fill those in. All right, so you can see that we got rid of that triangle and we were able to sort of re-topologize. This also means that we should probably think about adjusting these up here because having a bunch of these edges bunched together is never really a good thing. So I'm going to come from this crease. It's not a crease, it's where we put the bridge in there. But I'm going to come from there, work my way down, and back to the back. And I'll double click that edge and delete it and get rid of it. Now we will go back and make some adjustments and move things around a little bit. Right now I'm not too concerned with it. What I'm really focusing my attention on is getting these edge divisions in a good layout that makes sense for the curvature that we're trying to build. So we're going to repeat the process on the right side with insert point. This one we want to come a little bit more toward the center. And what I mean by center is this line, that last point that I selected there. If you were to carry it on the way that you drew it, you would want that to carry on to wherever the center of the wheel is. It generally is a good idea for us to do. It'll allow us to build a curvature a little bit better. So I'm going to just delete that edge. And Then I'm going to reconnect it over to here. So this will give me this triangle. I can get rid of it. I can use face and sort of fill in that area and say okay. So once again, the general process here is that we're trying to keep things relatively consistent. We don't really like when we've got these sections that are bunched up. In some cases, the geometry is going to force us to do this. So in this case, one of those times where we're really forced to push these into a layout that is not ideal. But it's, unfortunately, that's just how it is, but it doesn't mean that we can't get a good result out of it. This one here likely needs to be adjusted as well. We might be able to use slide edge, or we could use the same insert point option. Just so you know, anytime you see the browser go black, in Fusion 360, the browser is rendered to the screen over top of everything. It's actually, the way that it's done is slightly different than the rest of the UI. So sometimes when things are processing and they're really thinking, oftentimes you'll see that go black because you can actually undock the browser and put it wherever you want. And in this case, it's not white anymore, so you can't see through it. But when it's docked over here to the left-hand side, it's, you can see behind it. So it's kind of hard to visualize the fact that it's sort of blacked out like that. All right, so now let's see what we have in Smooth Display to see what needs to change. And this is usually the next step in this process. So if things look okay in Smooth Display, that's usually a good sign. I'm going to hide the edges and kind of take a look. So as we rotate this around, we can kind of see this crease right here is carried into the fender opening, which I don't like. Same thing over here. I really want that to be smooth. But overall, it looks pretty good. I mean, you can see we maintained somewhat of the original design. We've got the edges there. There is one problem that I see, and it's this extra edge here. Now, that could be okay if that was the design intent, but I'm not really sure that I want it there. So if we bring the edges back, we are going to tackle a couple of these problems. Now, first of which, we're going to start by going to Utilities and make Uniform and allow it to adjust the form body. Sometimes this is a good thing, sometimes it's not. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look and see what it did. It made a mess over here. So we're going to do Control Z to undo that. And we're going to do some of that manually. The next thing is this edge right here. So part of the reason why we're getting that crease is because of the way, it's going to be, sorry if you get motion sick here, but it's because of the way this bulges out then back in. Now, if you want an edge to control the geometry there, well, what you can do is you can delete some of these edges, allow those faces to sort of get back into, I guess, sort of a path of least resistance. And then you can add edges back in. So right now we've got these sort of T-points on the sides here. And just overall that looks okay, but we can kind of see there's something going on right here. Now, if you ever see an edge that looks like that, and you can kind of see what's happening in the surface, the best thing to do is to try to use Repair Body and see if there are any error stars or error points. Now, essentially what's happening is this N-gon, if we go back to box display, we've got this N-gon, or this thing that has 5 sides on it. So this is causing a problem because at this point, we have a lot of curvature change and it really doesn't know what to do. So this tells me that I need to work on retopologizing this. And I know I use that word quite a bit, but essentially what we need to do is we need to change the flow of these edges. So let's go back to a right view and let's kind of take a look at this and see what we can kind of adjust and plan out. I think what I want to try to do, and this may or may not work, but what I want to try to do is I'm going to go to Insert Point. And first I'm going to take, I don't like this point floating out in space. I'm going to take this up to the front and we'll come back and we'll move that later. And then I want to carry this one forward, but then I want to delete this edge and I want to weld these two together. Now, part of the reason that I want to do that is because I'm going to carry this edge up further. And while it's still going to be an N-gon, this is going to sort of fundamentally change the way that the curvature happens on that face. So we're just changing that end-on and forcing a little bit more control. So if we take a look at this in smooth display, and now we go to our repair body and we make some adjustments. We can make that T point or that star point a T point, and you can see when it's a star point, there's really a lot of problems in this surface. Some of them stem from this point right here. You can see that's carried forward as well. When I make this a T point, it sort of moves things around, but it doesn't fix my problem. So we're going to hit cancel, go back to our box display. Hopefully, let's see if it'll do it. All right, back to the box display. And if we don't need this edge here, better off to just delete it. Same thing on the back side. If we don't need it, we'll just delete it and take a look again. So with that gone, things seem to look a little bit better. And this is one of the reasons why oftentimes you'll hear me say that I avoid T-points and star points whenever possible, because honestly, they're nothing but trouble. You can't really get away from them on every design, but if you can get away from them, then I do suggest that you do. So there's a lot going on. It's still a lot to do, but we're making good progress. We now have those hard edges in our design that we struggled with before. And again, a lot of this is getting cut out, so I don't really care what's happening up here. It doesn't look great up here, but it's all going to get cut out based on the original fender. So that stuff doesn't really matter to me. All these little sort of wobbles and things that are happening in the surface, because I'm going to cut it at the bumper line. So cut it here, cut it at the bumper line and around that marker light. So just keep in mind that all that stuff is going away. So overall, this looks pretty good. I do not like what's happening here, so I want to put a little bit more effort into that. I think that we can do a better job there. But overall, I think we're getting quite a bit closer. So back on the edges, back on box display, what we can do is we can tighten up this transition a little bit. And to do that, I'm going to go to Insert Edge. And I'm going to put an edge, let's say right there. Now, when I do this, so if we take this edge and we try to delete it, we're going to see if Fusion can patch everything up. And it does a pretty good job. There are some things that we need to change. So for example, down here, we don't really want that point there. So I'm going to pull this over. That'll clean that up. And did that happen anywhere else? No, it doesn't look like it did. So overall, what we did was we sort of made that lip, that flare, a little bit smaller. And I'm also going to end up adding another edge to control it a bit more. And this is where I say that this is an area where Fusion struggles because, well, not Fusion, but forms in general struggle, because it's really hard for us to get that geometry to be perfectly round or perfectly consistently spaced, but it is possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this edge. Actually, you know what? Let's take this edge and let's add a bevel. So I'm going to do, instead of 0.05, I'm going to do 0.1. And then I'm going to take this other edge. Instead of doing a bevel, I'm going to insert edge simply because it's going to cause problems if I do a bevel down there. But I'm going to put it relatively close as well. And then, I don't know why that insert location is staying there. I've noticed that today. The little notes stay there for a second. So again, this transition here where the edge is perfectly straight, and we don't want that. So we can move this edge or scale it or do something with it, but we need to make an adjustment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move it ever so slightly back and then say okay. Take a look at this in smooth display. All right, so there's still more to do, but let's take a look at this with our edges off. So now you can see there is a very well-defined edge there, and there's a very well-defined edge there. So we're looking closer to what an actual arc or a fender flare would look like. Now, in order to get there, we had to add all those additional edges to help control it. Now, this is where the sort of order of operations is really important, because you can't just start adding these very early in the design, otherwise it becomes much harder to control. You want it to look approximately right in the box display, and once the box display is looking okay, then we can start to go back. And you'll notice that I mentioned a few times I didn't like the way that these edges transitioned into the flare portion, but I didn't want to start adding those edges all the way to the flare because I knew that I needed to add additional creases or controls. So what we're going to do now is go back to insert point. We're going to come from here and we're going to bring this a little bit further into the first edge of that new flare. And we're going to repeat the process. Now these ones down here are really close together, but I'm going to do the same thing. Notice that I'm actually changing the angle or the width. It's tapering away, and that's intentional. One reason is because it'd be really hard to get it to be perfectly parallel, but another reason is because this will help us fade the edge away. So if you want it to stay pretty tight, then you would keep those two edges parallel. If you want it to fade away, then you would, add sort of taper them away as you go. All right, so now that edge is being carried into the fender. It is turning down, and part of the reason for that is because that's how it is inside of our design. So if we want it to go straight, we need to move these vertices and those edges, we need to move them so that they're straight. And again, we can use things like the scale options, and then we want to move all of this stuff here. So I'm going to just do this manually. I always say that it's not a good idea to do this manually. There are some cases where you just have to, or it's just quicker. And I'm not worried about this design being perfect. As I'm looking at it, I don't really like the way that this flares out. So from the front, I want to move that in just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and just pull that back in. And when I'm doing this, what I'm looking at right now is the transition or the angle between the edges of that face. That's kind of helping me drive where that should be. And I don't like the fact that this face right here, where that T-point is, where it has an angle between it, because that can introduce some problems in the surface. So that might be an area where we need to spend a little bit more time. But if we get rid of our edges, now you can see instead of drooping down so bad, this edge is essentially straight back. Not perfect. Again, I'm not worried about the design being perfect, but overall it's accomplishing what I want. I really wanted that style line to be there, and it's looking pretty good. Now we need to fix the same sort of problems on the back side. And in order to do that, I'm just going to follow the same process. Again, this is sort of drooping down. So what I want to do before I get too far is I am going to move this. I'm not going to be able to get it perfectly horizontal, but I do want to move it a little bit. And I'll probably move this one as well. And again, it's in an ideal world, you want those to be pointing toward the center of the wheel. In this case, what I'm doing is I am just making sure that I'm not making a drastic change to their angle, because anytime I do this, it's going to be a little bit tricky to do this manually, especially if you start doing something like moving a single vertex like that, because what you're doing is you're affecting the distance between those two edges, and that can be problematic. So now that we've sort of moved that into place, I'm going to go to Insert Point, and I am going to sort of add it there. Now there is another way that we can do this, and that would be to use Insert Edge. So for example, if I'm inserting an edge just right here, I could insert the edge relatively close, but you can see what's happening because the angle distance, or the difference between the angles on these faces, it's actually going the distance between these two edges here, and it's it's just not gonna work in this case. In some instances, you can get away with that. In this case, it's just not gonna work for us. We have to do it manually with insert point. So we're gonna come in, find that point. This one I'm gonna take as straightforward as possible because I wanna carry this edge. And I'm gonna do this one more time. And again, some things that we should always look at. Whenever you have a T-point like this, you never want these two edges to have that little bend in them. You always want that edge where the T-point is to be straight. Otherwise, you don't really have great control over what the curvature is doing after that point. So Control N4. And now you can see that we have gotten rid of that weird ripple that we had up there. We are carrying those hard edges like the original design. And overall, it's looking pretty good. Overall, I'm happy with the shape. If we look at it from the front, I'm going to change this to just perspective. And when we look at it from the front, we're carrying that sort of OEM edge, that ridge that was there, just made it quite a bit wider. So we have the OEM front piece, we have this lip, and again, a lot of this, everything from here down is going to get cut away. So I don't really care what's going on here and that this is lipping around. This is really just trying to match the bumper shape, so that way when we carried it through the design, it was sort of apparent. We could do a little bit more work in here, but overall that looks pretty good. There is a little bit of a jog that happens there, but I think that's okay. So yeah, that's okay. This edge is probably a little tighter than the factory edge, or at least it looks a little bit tighter. But overall, I think it's okay. The other thing that we need to think about is this T-point. Now, I mentioned that a little bit ago, how that's potentially problematic. We need to think about whether or not we need it, especially once we get past that first edge. So if I hit delete and try to clean that up, you can see that these two edges are no longer parallel. So that's a problem for us because we want to make sure that they stay an equidistant apart. I can take this down to, let's just say to the other side of this one and hit enter. Those are already straight, so I shouldn't have a problem with those edges. And if I take a look at this in smooth display, I want to make sure that I didn't accidentally make myself more work. So what I'm going to do is just rotate it around. Remember, this is all getting cut out in that area, but I still want to work towards making sure that it's okay. And this is also a great way if you wanted to redo, obviously not on this car, but if you wanted to redo things like where the marker lights are, you can carry those details a bit further up. That can be really helpful. Let's also make sure that the back edge is okay, the way that this rolls into the fender. And I think that looks pretty good. If you want to carry this into the fender more, the way that we would do that, so for example, if we wanted it to go into the fender but fade away, I would carry it across this and then maybe bring it out just a bit. Now generally when we use insert point, we want to go back and we want to edit or adjust that edge. But what this allows us to do is potentially carry that into the flare a little bit. We can kind of see the way the reflection is looking. Now, I don't want to do that for this case, but just kind of mentioning it that if you want to, you can. And you can kind of see when we undo and redo the way that the curvature changes, it pulls this edge up as well. And again, these are just things that you have to kind of have to work with and deal with. Now, from an overall standpoint, I'm going to go to Control 4 and hide my edges. From an overall standpoint, I think this looks pretty good. It still does need a little bit of work. For example, down here, we need to connect all of this geometry together. And now we have a bunch of these little edges that are going to make this more of a challenge. We also need to think about how much of a wheel arch we actually need. So one good way to kind of fix this is to insert another edge, potentially close to the front, double click on that back edge, and then just delete it. So that way we can shorten up the lip. Now in reality, the lip is going to be fairly small, especially if you're trying to tuck a really big tire. So if you have to do that again and pull it a bit closer, and then maybe extrude that out so we can take this edge, again, delete it, and then maybe take this lip using modify edit form and sort of extrude it out. So again, we want to make sure that the pivot point is roughly where the center of the wheel is. I didn't scan the center of the wheel, so kind of have to just guess. And so once again, Alt and Control, and I'm just going to scale that out just a little bit. And now if we rotate this around, I'm going to hide the mesh, speed things up a little bit. So now you can see we just built that lip on the inside, give it a little bit more structure. But at this point, we do need to fill in this corner. We need to figure out what's going to happen here. And again, we have a couple of extra edges, which unfortunately complicate things. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one here. I'm going to pull it forward so that it's roughly about where this is. And then can start building out all the little pieces that connect it. Now there's, again, as I mentioned, there's kind of a lot going on here with all of these extra edges. We can build T-points, but it's going to be tricky for us to do on the fly. So what I generally would do is maybe get rid of the edge in the middle of this one. Now I'm going to have to go back and add it later, but what this allows me to do is potentially use tools like bridge or face, and then build a face off of this. And then I can insert points. So I know that I've got a division here, and I know that I've got a division there. So then I can come back and weld the vertices together. So maybe bring this up to here, maybe bring this back to there. And this is the way in which we can start building out these little pieces. Now at this point, this thing is not going to let us go into smooth display. It just doesn't know what to do in that corner. If it does, it's going to be really nasty. But what we could do is, again, we can add those extra edges. We can use insert edge and put one maybe right there, and then right click marking menu, put one right there. And these are all flat, and usually that's a pretty bad thing. In this case, I don't really care because it's at the bottom of this lip. But now I can go back and use insert point, carry this back across, maybe to there, just let it build a T-point. And if we take a look at this in smooth display now, Control 4 and hide the edges. So you can kind of see we building out that little flared piece and how it rolls in. And you can certainly continue to work on the transition here. So for example, if we wanted a little bit more control over that as a corner, what I could do is bring this all the way to the end and then start to move some of this. So for example, if I bring this down a little bit and maybe bring this down, now what we're doing is we're carrying that curvature a little bit further. Now this inside edge being a crease is not ideal because now we've got a crease that ends at a smooth section. And what we can do is we can uncrease that. I'm going to go in and uncrease it. And after we uncrease it, then we need to go back and insert another edge or bevel it. So that way we are controlling it a bit tighter. Again, less than ideal, especially since we had that crease there for a reason. And this corner is probably going to bite us later. What I want to do is I'm just going to make some adjustments to it. Potentially pull some of this down. So modify, and let's just see. We want to grab those two and pull them down. Take a look at the OEM. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to build a straight line wherever the OEM air dam would be. So I'm not really sure what to do with the air dam just yet, but I do want this to be able to sort of end where the OEM air dam is, and then I can decide if I want to build a new one or if I want to keep the original sort of shape and maybe build a little piece that attaches to it to get that extra shape or change. But we're just gonna, keep manipulating, and this is kind of the name of the game. When you start working with these forms, like I said, it takes a lot of time. You could really just spend a whole lot of time and effort making these minute changes to get everything perfect. It's much easier when you have a good game plan and you take the time to do things like scale the edges or rotate the edges or move them all together, because then you're not dealing with this same sort of problem. But now you can see this is roughly where the bumper is. Probably need to make some adjustments, but overall that looks pretty good. I do want to roll it a bit more, but this is all stuff that we've done, and I don't think it's really worth the time going through and having you watch me do all of that. So I want to make sure that we focus our attention on the pieces that are new, which a lot of the stuff we did in this video was kind of a new approach. On the backside, I think, the OEM bottom of the fender is kind of here. It rolls under the car, and there's a sill underneath, or on the wide bodies, there's a side skirt that goes over that. Likely what I would do is build a side skirt that goes where the bottom of the door is. But since I didn't scan the door and the rear fender, I don't have all the data for that. So what I'm likely going to do is I'm likely going to take this edge and pull it down to meet that. So I'm just going to scale it vertically and then move it sort of down and back. Maybe pull this one forward a little bit. And then I'm going to take a couple of these edges. Let's see how many. Let's take all of these actually. And I take all of these edges up until here, and I'm going to extrude them backwards. So hold down Alt, just bring it back. Remember, in box display, what we're looking for here is we're looking to get a good idea of the overall shape. So with that edge still selected, I'm going to come back to the back, and I'm going to scale these, again, pulling them mostly straight. I'm going to worry later about how it's going to fit, because ultimately to tuck a bigger wheel in here, all of the OEM stuff is going to have to get cut away. So I am going to have to deal with that. But then I can take, take this edge and just move it forward, or I guess backwards, based on how we're looking at it, and I'm going to merge that together. So we'll use weld vertices and stick all of that together. It's taken a little bit of time each time I make some of these moves and convert it. And that's because even though we're looking at it in box display, in the back end, what it's actually doing is it's recalculating all of those extra little pieces. Keep in mind that when we do stuff like this, we are ultimately what we're doing is building a surface that's going to get thickened in most cases, right? Because this is open. So we do want to make sure that we take the time and get most of these pieces right. I'm going to add another edge down here using insert point and just carry that forward up until there. And then I want to take this edge and I'm going to bevel it. All right, so now let's take a look at this. Smooth display, Control and 4. And I think we're pretty much there. I think I could spend a lot of time doing some fine refinements, and I'll probably do that between videos. But I think overall, this looks pretty good. I think that I want to work in this area a little bit. As I move it around, you can kind of see there's like a little bit of a shadow there. It's probably based on this edge and the way in which that edge sort of works here. Now you can try to completely delete an edge and see what the smooth display looks like. Some cases it might actually be okay. So like in this case, that smoothed it out pretty well. You might not be able to meet the geometry at the top anymore. So you have to really think about, where you need the control. So if I was going to do this, I might go all the way to the bottom, maybe to there, and delete that, leaving that T-point up top. And that way the fender is okay, but you can see it kind of leaves a crease up top. So Maybe get rid of a couple more edges. Yeah, it just basically it just does not like having that edge there. So again, you know, these are things that you're just going to have to look at, play around with, figure out what your design needs to look like and where these edges make sense. I think that's okay. Probably would want to make a little bit of adjustment. You can see it's below the fender there. But I think overall, I think we hit, you know, sort of hit the mark. Again, off video, I'm going to go through it. I'm going to make a bunch of adjustments. I'm going to make a quick save. I haven't saved it at all. But we're going to make a bunch of adjustments off of the video. But let's go ahead and let's hop into render, which is automatically going to force a finished form. Let's see. It does not like this. There's something that self-intersects. So it looks like I'm going to need to put a little bit more work into it now. Probably an issue with this right here. So I'm going to go to box display, see if I can find where there's a problem. Again, it probably doesn't like this. Yeah, so you can see right there. So what's happening is this edge right here isn't creased, and this side's probably the same. That side's okay. So that edge isn't creased. A quick fix is to just crease that, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. Generally not a good idea to roll back on it like that unless we're going to fill it completely in. But once we have a crease there, finishing the form should be fine. It still says that there's a self-intersection, and it's highlighting it here in red. So let's figure out what's going on there. So in order to really identify this, in box display, I don't really notice an issue, but this face that we have selected, you can see right there that this corner is actually not attached. So if I move this out, you can see there's like this extra lip that's not attached. It's just kind of open in there. So this is stuff that sometimes you can't instantly see when you're just looking at things in the smooth display or the box display. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and I'm going to use weld vertices, and I'm just going to pull that back to here. And hopefully that fixes the problem. So it looks a bit better. Could spend some more time sort of finessing that, but now it lets us finish. Okay. So we're going to bring back that fender, and I'm going to go into render and just take a look at it. So everything's looking pretty good. I've got the nice hard lines that I'm looking for. It's sitting a little bit below the fender. Before we're completely done, we'll push that up to the mesh, and we can see how much wider it is at the front. So a little piece for the air dam to fill in that gap could be fine. Again, because the front is still the same, it could just build off of there because it still matches the bumper up until here. And on the back side, we've got our gap with the door. So what we really want to see, which might be hard to see here, is that the lines of the fender are, okay, that's really hard to see. What we want to identify is the lines on the fender, which this faint line right here, which is kind of hard to see. From the side, we want that line and this line to be at the same height. And the reason for that is because that line carries onto the door and it actually wraps up to the roof. And I want that line to be part of the design. So from the side, this could just look like something from the factory, and then you rotate it around and it's just quite a bit wider. So I think we did a pretty good job of nailing that. There are some issues, some potential issues that I need to deal with in here, the way that these creases work, but overall that looks pretty good. So yeah, I'm gonna do a couple renders of this and just make sure I'm happy with the shape. And I think that overall, this ended up being a good mix of design elements that matched the original sort of shape of the car which I wanted to preserve because it is unique. There weren't very many of them, and there's so many more wide bodies out there. But this gives me the ability to put wider tires underneath. So at this stage, the next part of this process is to make this a solid after I do some more modifications to it. And then we need to start doing the surfacing work, or we need to figure out, where the cuts need to be for the marker light and all of those extra little pieces before it's a solid and before we can start 3D printing sections of it to fit it to the car. So if you have any questions at this point, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.